Good evening, folks. I think you've all made it out of the green room. Yep. My name is Alice Hutchinson, and I'm the owner of Birds Books, an independent bookstore in Bethel, Connecticut. And I'm thrilled to be the host of our annual poetry series. Birds Books tries to do one every year, but one year in the pandemic, we weren't able to do it. I apologize for my stuffy nose. It's seasonal allergies, and it's just life. But this night is one of two evenings hosted on Zoom. So I'm really thrilled for this evening. We're hosting readings by and conversations with Marilyn Nelson, Lloyd Schwartz, and Jonathan Anderson. I'll return at the end after the readings to bring any questions that you might have or comments to the authors, and we'll have a conversation. During the episode, please feel free to make your comments or ask questions in the chat, but we do ask that you please remain muted. Tonight's episode is being recorded, so if you missed something, you can go back and rewatch. The Birds Books YouTube channel is on the looking at you, the right hand on the right-hand side of the front page of the website. So our first poet this evening is Jonathan Anderson. His most recent collection of poems, Augur, which was the recipient of the David Matheson Meadowlark Poetry Prize and a finalist for the 2019 Connecticut Book Award in Poetry. His poems have appeared in print and online publications, including Cafe Review, Freshwater, Hanging Loose, Here, New American Writing, Nimrod, North American Review, Patterson Literary Review, The Progressive, Rattle, and Salt, among others. An educator for 29 years, Anderson is currently a professor of English at Connecticut State Community College, Quinnebog Valley in Danielson and Willimantic, Connecticut. Please welcome to the screen, Jonathan Anderson. I'm going to add your spotlight.
Thank
There you
you.
go. Of course.
Thank you, Alice.
Sure.
I really appreciate being part of this. I love Birds Books. I love what you're doing, and I love the spring series. And it's a tremendous thrill to read with Marilyn Nelson, who I first admired as a poet and as a person when I had her as a professor of mine in an English class at UConn over 30 years ago. Sorry about that, Marilyn. Maybe I shouldn't have let the time be known. But and it's great to meet Professor Schwartz here, Lloyd Schwartz, whose work I also admire, but I've never met. I'm going to begin with one place. I come here to figure nothing out, to sit facing this little marsh, its grasses, the oak sapling that bends out of dim woods, limned by morning sun, leaves the red of light blood and water swirling down a sink drain. I want to be like someone still waiting to acquire language. There's a skittering, and I look up to see a leaf falling, hitting branches on the way down, like that one without language, scrambling down a fire escape. This morning, little slashes of light over sunk branches. Sometimes I do figure something out. My electrical panel, or good questions for Luis, or dialectics, or what the hell was wrong with me last night. When everything is nearly too bright to look at, and then a cloud moves over, and the sky and the water disappears. The mild darkness here is nice. It's not a metaphor. I listen to the burble of the marsh spill into a stream. The title of my next poem is One Place, and I'm not losing it. It's not the same poem, and it's not the same place, just the same title. This is one place we come to kill ourselves, Extramart, at the intersection of 44 and 74. Cokes, 2 for $3.50. Vape kits, Monster, double payday, mega money scratchers, 3 grades of gas under the big blue roof, and over to the sides, diesel for the rigs. I sit in my car, scarfing down ding-dongs. I get out to get rid of the evidence, and halfway across the lot become aware of the light, the sky turning dramatically orange. Everything aglow. The autumn leaves are even oranger. The dumpsters are still blue, but sit in the luminance. People actually stop and laugh together, and holy shit, and cool. A big bearded guy walks out of the store, swinging his giggling boy, and Long leaps out before him. They stop too. Someone runs back in and runs back out with Connie from behind the counter. The guy hoists the boy up onto his shoulders and they turn, looking all around. The orange is already fading. I lick my fingers and think, happily, I bet that boy remembers for a very long time. This next poem is actually just a little short narrative that takes place just up the road from that Extra Mart. Since 1970. Since 1970, vertebrate populations have dropped 70%. I have to yell it again, alone in the car, foot pulsing the gas, taking off at the green, trying to understand with the little sparking lump of gray matter that sits atop my spinal column what I've just heard on the radio. 70%. Since the year I was born, most thrusting, barking, flapping, swimming, snapping beings gone. But I am here, flowing along through the cold, failing light in this long line of traffic. An old stone wall falls and rises beside the road, broken in places, through stones slipped out, sinking into the duff. And I remember as a kid turning stones, the thrill of finding salamanders, those little dinosaurs. And I realize that right now, I'm a disc, maybe a T9 or 10, in a spine of smoking taillights, dipping all the way down to the marsh, bending back up the hill towards the moon on the other side. Looking at images from the James Webb Telescope, and I'm just counting on people having seen some of these images, knowing what the James Webb Telescope has brought us, the swirls and the lights and gleamings of maybe the first stars and the unimaginable distances back into the cosmos. So looking at images from the James Webb Telescope, I see smoke slow churning in my grandparents' bar, billions of particles in dirty, very late afternoon light. The smoke encircles the frozen, bright white explosion of Poppy's hair. He sits on a shiny pew from a country church he and my uncle dismantled down in Flanders. Road crew guys and carpenters take turns at 9-ball, striking the spears across worn green felt, the balls smacking against each other one at a time, caught wobbling over a hole before dropping into a darkness no one will ever see. One man's face is furiously red. The jukebox glows red, yellow, candy green. I hear sundown become, you picked a fine time to leave me, Lucille, staying alive. I see myself holding my mother's hand, waving bye-bye. We step out, the front door bells jingling, our breath freezing and rising into the night. It's a tiny bar at the edge of town, under an expanse of stars. This scene, I'm in it. I see it now. It's here right in front of my eyes, though eons ago it flared and ceased to exist. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, ran a bar called the Rustic Cafe for over half a century, and my mom, who's in the audience, hi mom, I always want to say that, will recognize some of that. She'll also recognize some of maybe the inconsistencies. It was actually a bumper pool table, not a regular billiards 9-ball table, but no one knows what bumper pool is, so you have to make adjustments for literature. So this poem also reaches back into the past, but much further back than the 1970s, but not nearly so back as the birth of galaxies and that kind of thing. In 1518, there was a dancing plague in Strasbourg, France, near the German border, where peasants just began to dance. And then more and more joined them. They couldn't help themselves. And there are some sources that say that many danced themselves to death, although that's a point of controversy. There were various theories. There have been various theories about what caused this plague, this dancing plague, and probably the most likely one, the one that we seem to that seems to be in favor now, is that it was a case of, not simply, but a case of mass hysteria. You know, human beings, our psyches influencing each other, catching fire, you know, with each other. The theory at the time was that it was Saint Vitus, you know, punishing the peasants by forcing them to dance. You wonder, do you not? Sitting here at your buddy's wedding, a little sloshy, waving off the 1,000 reaching arms of the conga line and its 500 laughing, shouting heads passing by, you wonder if what you've read about the dancing plagues could be true, don't you? That scorching summer in Strasbourg, 1518, the peasants, at first without music, one by one, then more and more, unable to stop swinging each other around, giggling, jigging, high-stepping, old man leaning on his stick, moving his bony hips because that's what he could do, all falling down, staggering back up after quick naps, grabbing a cup or bread off the plank as they wheeled by, or hobbled by with bleeding feet, or falling again onto torn knees upon which they still danced for days and nights, caught in the circle dance, the egg, the sword, their wailing caught in the laughing and wailing of father, mother, neighbor, gap-toothed beauty. You can see it, right? And it seems impossible to believe, doesn't it, that as many as 15 people a day dance themselves into heart attacks, strokes, heat exhaustion deaths, that they danced over the dead and danced together as they carried the dead to wherever they piled the no longer dancing, that they went shuffling backwards across cobblestone in what we'd call the moonwalk, or Dick Van Dyked it across rooftops, flailed into TikTok-worthy whole shack shimmies and crip walks in red shoes. Now, the last one sitting at your big round table, in your rented tux, in this rented hall, watching everyone else in the world get down, your giddy pal getting it on the parquet with mother-in-law, brother-in-law, his blushing bride, those dumbasses who will work and never, ever pay off their debts, this blast among them now. You think about the latest theory. Years of bowed backs, prayers, crop failures, disease, famine, war, bodies like plumb bobs hanging in the square for their beliefs, and you realize that the logic of punishing joy, it's either dance or lay ourselves down to die anyway, really makes perfect sense, no? And you stand up. Bluebird. What to say to someone who has not seen it? Blue enough to make you believe reality is but a hologram. Blue enough to make you get a third job just so you can quit them all one day and start walking from ocean to ocean. Blue enough to be a hyperlink to God. More than a dolphin's soul. More than Kal-El's eyes. More blue than the black they claim to be so black it's blue. One flash of that blue, and you'll recall a whole week of first grade. How you wrote capital B's and lowercase b's. How each word, book and bat and bell, whooshed up like a gas flame. In a fluttering in the meadow this morning, something opens for all of us. but briefly. Maybe I should have mentioned, for those who don't, Kal-El was Superman's Kryptonian name. So I was going to end there, but just before we started here, I decided I'm compelled to read this poem. So maybe as a coda, I guess, to this my little contribution here. Lesson in simile and metaphor. A skinny little girl stands in a hospital. I'll give you that she looks like a ghost, caked, as she is, with plaster dust. And yes, she screams like a banshee, though our next lesson will be on cliché. Don't worry about that now. Here, we are trying to learn how to see what is there and what is really not there. Cables hang down and water pours from the ceiling, but on the other side of the lobby, there is no wall. It's just outside, and outside is just clouds, which also seem to be screaming. The girl wears a mask of blood her father left for her when the rocket blasted him into Jhana, Kingdom Come, or Oblivion. Okay now, what is she like? Or she is what? What would you say? Thank you.
John, thank you. Really. I'm gonna... Our next poet is Marilyn Nelson. She is the author of many award-winning books, including August Savage, which was named to Kirkus School Library Journal and the Horn's Best Books of the Year, in addition to receiving a Black Caucus ALA Honor and Bank Street College of Education Claudia Lewis Award for Poetry. She is also the author of Carver, A Life in Poems, which was a National Book Award finalist, a Newbery Honor Book, and a Coretta Scott King Honor Book, and a Wreath for Emmett Till, which garnered a Coretta Scott King Honor, a Prins Honor, and a Lee Bennett Hopkins Poetry Award Honor. Marilyn lives in Connecticut and was its poet laureate from 2001 to 2006. Let me get you here, Marilyn. I will go away now.
Thank you. Thanks, Allison. Thanks for this, for me, very pleasant reunion with you and John and Lloyd from back in my brief Boston days, summer days in Boston. It's really great to be back together again. I have been struggling to try to decide what to read, and I think only because Alice, you mentioned this Augusta Savage book, I hadn't planned to read from it, but since now it's in my mind, I've been trying to banish it and move on. I'll read a couple of poems from this. Unfortunately, I can't see the page numbers very well. This book is about a sculptor named Augusta Savage who made a reputation as an artist, as an independent woman who lived as an artist, and as an art teacher and organizer during the Harlem Renaissance. For her, it was late in the Renaissance, in the beginning of almost the 30s. I'll just read 3 poems about her life as I think most people can imagine the life of an African American woman with artistic talent and ambition in the early part of this 20th century. This is 21st. Oh my God. At the early part of the 20th century, what difficulties she faced. And this is a poem about one of the turning points when she finally received a fellowship to study sculpture in Rome. And that was in 1926. I should have practiced this a little bit better because my eyeglasses are not good. Okay. This is the Rome Fellowship. It's one of the turning points of the life of Augusta Savage, 1926. Dr. Du Bois fought for me. That's W.E.B. Du Bois. Dr. Du Bois fought for me. He arranged a fellowship for me to go to Rome for a whole year, fully paid for, except for the ocean liner to Italy. The traditional bait and switch most Negroes know. That's why our people had to invent the blues. How was I supposed to pay for the ticket? I was still reeling when a hurricane destroyed my family's home in West Palm Beach. Mama and Papa, Irene, and my last born sisters and brothers were left homeless. They came to Harlem, to my 1-bedroom. The joyful family reunion, Papa's stroke, the hospital, his paralysis, the bills. Lord, you keep telling the same ironic joke of Job. The hours of sweating in a steam laundry to make ends meet. Awake, surrounded by the wall-to-wall breathing of those I love the most in all the world, I almost laugh. You made an artist a woman and Black? This next poem is another turning point in her life that happened shortly after that lowest point. She made a sculpture that brought her some fame. It was used as a cover of NAACP magazine. It's called Gammon, 1929. Art invents materials, media where there are none. Poems written in matchbooks, sculptures of paper mache. Time to create art stolen in miniature increments, a few minutes here or there to create one true gesture, one movement toward truth. My gammon, spit and image of my nephew Ellis, who sleeps under the table and has affected a hep strut since he arrived in New York. No longer a small town boy, he's wised up. He cocks his head, pulls his cap's bill down to one side, lifts his collar, looks with a bemused, level gaze at the ridiculous and cruel stupidity this world abounds in. 14 going on 40, his lips half curved knowingly, gammon turned my tide. The Crisis, that's the name of the magazine. The Crisis, the official magazine of the NAACP, made gammon its cover. And like a falling line of good luck dominoes, connected people saw it and told people with money. The Julius Rosenwald Fund presented me with a check. My family gave its blessing, and now I'm in Montparnasse, the left bank of the Seine, in the 14th arrondissement. I'm here studying sculpture at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière in Paris, censored, France. I guess I was planning to do something completely different, but my time is nearing its end, so maybe I'll just read again, continue to read from Augusta Savage. Another delightful, she made a lot of sculptures of children, African-American children. And this is a little girl about 3 years old, I would guess, whose name is Lenore. The sculpture is dated 1935. It wasn't easy to sit still so long while Mrs. Savage looked at me with narrowed eyes, stepped close to gently push me a teensy bit to one side, or straightened the big red bow my dear pinned to my sundress to look like a butterfly choosed my shoulder to stop on. Or she moved my red hair bow just a little bit, then stepped out of the real world and back into art. And art is what she says she's making, and I'm helping, because art's like when you say a word with your mouth and then write it on paper, like the word cat. And when you come back the next day or later, the word's still there, but you can't quite remember when your mouth said cat or why. When the fidgets grew inside me like a beehive, I couldn't help it. All them bees buzzing louder and louder, like my dear says the word free used to buzz inside people till they ran away. My bees ain't told me to run away, even though I heard the double Dutch rope slap on the sidewalk and the big girls chant. My bees buzzed louder, louder. They said, "Tell Mrs. Savage you got to wee-wee." I don't know, do I have time for?
Yes, ma'am, you do have time.
Maybe, um, 2 sonnets? I'll read
Please.
just 2. What I was planning to do was not to read from Augusta Savage, but to read some poems that have been published in little places and never collected, and I've been thinking about doing a new and selected volume because I'll be 80 in 2 years, and it seems like it would be nice to have this there as a birthday present to myself. So I'm going to read some poems. They were written 25 years ago. And they were published reluctantly because, well, you'll understand why. They're my bad marriage poems. I was struggling to learn to write sonnets, and the project I used as the learning experience was this series of poems about the marriage I was ending. And I have never republished, they came out in 2 little beautiful chapbooks, very limited edition, handmade paper, beautiful hand set type, and so on. There's a total, ta-da! There's a total of 20, I think maybe 21 of these beginning sonnets. And I never republished them because it was therapy. It was, I don't feel they're the poems I want to leave behind me in the world. It was therapy for coming out of a difficult marriage, to someone who is still one of my lifelong closest friends. Someone I wouldn't want him to be hurt by these poems. He's read them and he says, well, if you need the money, and this would bring some notoriety to your book, then I think you should include them. So I'm thinking about that. So I'm going to read from one of the chapbooks, which is called Partial Truth. And it was published in 1992. Okay, these are sonnets, Partial Truth, published in 1992. I'll just read 2 of them. There's a little note about the title. The title is Partial Truth, and there is a definition. Partial means inclined to favor one party more than the other, biased, or of or relating to a part rather than the whole, not general or total. So I want the truth of these to be understood as partial. This is called To Forget. I can't forget the trembling of his hands the day he took my hands and kissed a seal between us. How he couldn't understand the ecstasy he'd taught me how to feel. How, when I swooned with love, he pulled away, disgusted by my lack of self-control. How, fearing that he'd laugh I didn't say I hoped he'd be the half that made me whole. My anger alternates with my regret, yin yang of positive and negative, remembered scenes and words I can't forget, and therefore cannot totally forgive. In memories, that anguish is still mine. To forgive is human, to forget divine. Let's see, I said I'd read two. I should say that I was married to a German man, a Prussian, who was always on time, among other things. And so this is also about cultures meeting. This is the last poem I'll read. It's called How Did I Love Him? I loved him with a passion put to use in childhood's longing for identity. I loved him for his detailed and profuse remembered past. It gave a past to me. I loved him for the thin potato soup, the push meat sandwiches after the war, his mother's sneaking up on him to swoop him up and wrestle him to the floor. I loved his college and his army days, his trips to capitals I'd never seen, the operas and concerts, films and plays I saw as he described them with a keen and narcissistic vision. With what grace I bent to kiss his sky and saw my face. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next poet is Lloyd Schwartz. He is the Frederick S. Troy Professor of English Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, a longtime commentator on classical music and the arts for the National Public Radio's Fresh Air, and a noted editor of Elizabeth Bishop's poetry and prose. He has been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism, Guggenheim and the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships in Poetry, and the Poet Laureateship of the City of Somerville, Massachusetts. His poems have appeared in the New Yorker, New Republic, and Atlantic. Among his poetry books are Little Kisses, Cairo Traffic, and Good Night, Gracie, all published by the University of Chicago Press. And I'm going to find you here, Lloyd.
Here I am.
There you are.
Thank you, Alice.
Of course.
It's really great to be reading for you again. Some of my happiest experiences of reading have been with Write America, which you were responsible for running. And what a delight to be reading with John, whom I just got to meet tonight, and to Marilyn, who has just been a very important figure in my life, which I will explain in a few minutes in a more particular way. One of the things that I think the three of us reading tonight have in common is that, excuse me, is that we've been involved in translation, either as the subjects or the translators themselves. And I would I'd like to begin with a short translation of a great poem by the Hungarian poet Attila József. And I have to confess that I do not know any Hungarian whatsoever. So we could talk about what it's like to translate from a language one doesn't know, or not. But I think this is it's called, this is a poem I love, and it's called The Gardener's Song. And I think it's a kind of timely. The Gardener's Song. In a garden of my own making, the trees and I will soon be waking. Shyly, I'll while away the hours, planting seeds and tending flowers. And so I'll sow, and so I'll reap, planting in my sleep. So what if all the flowers are weeds? Don't all of us derive from seeds? I'll drink my milk and smoke my pipe till even my good name gets ripe. If danger's lurking all around, I'll plant myself inside the ground. We need this, east and west. We know this, know what's for the best. And if the world's too late to save, I'll plant a flower on its grave. Marilyn probably has no reason to remember this whatsoever, but it was very important. It was very important to me because back in the early 90s, she was the person who was running a program called the Connecticut Poetry Circuit. And she invited me to read poems all over Connecticut as part of the Connecticut Poetry Circuit. And so I wanted to read a couple of kind of older poems that I am sure were poems that I read when I was doing that circuit of reading in Connecticut. And they're two sonnet sequences. And I didn't know how close one of them was going to be to some of the poems that John was reading tonight. So I think this is a happy coincidence. They're both, each of these poems are 3 unrhymed sonnets each. And the first one is called Leaves. 1. Every October, it becomes important, no, necessary, to see the leaves turning, to be surrounded by leaves turning. It's not just the symbolism to confront in the death of the year your death, one blazing farewell appearance, though the irony isn't lost on you that nature is most seductive when it's about to die, flaunting the dazzle of its incipient exit, an ending that at least so far the effects of human progress, pollution, acid rain, have not yet frightened you enough to make you believe is real. That is, you know this ending is a deception, because of course nature is always renewing itself. The trees don't die, they just pretend, go out in style, and return in style, a new style. 2. Is it deliberate how far they make you go, especially if you live in the city, to get far enough away from home to see not just trees, but only trees? The boring highways, road signs, high speeds, 10-axle trucks passing you as if they were in an even greater hurry than you to look at leaves? So you drive in terror for literal hours, and it looks like rain or snow, but it's probably just clouds. Too cloudy to see any color? And you wonder, given the poverty of your memory, which road had the most color last year? But it doesn't matter, since you're probably too late anyway, or too early. Whichever road you take will be the wrong one, and you've probably come all this way for nothing. 3. You'll be driving along depressed when suddenly a cloud will move and the sun will muscle through and ignite the hills. It may not last, probably won't last, but for a moment, the whole world comes to, wakes up, proves it lives. It lives. Red, yellow, orange, brown, russet, ochre, vermilion, gold, flame and rust. Flame and rust, the permutations of burning. You're on fire. Your eyes are on fire. It won't last. You don't want it to last. You can't stand anymore. But you don't want it to stop. It's what you've come for. It's what you've come back for. It won't stay with you, but you'll remember that it felt like nothing else you felt, or something you felt that also didn't last. And this is another set of 3 sonnets. And it's the title poem of my book, Goodnight, Gracie. And I hope some of you will remember who Gracie Allen was and who the comedy team of Burns and Allens were. They were on the radio and they had their own television show. And each of these 3 sonnet stanzas begins with quotations from Gracie Allen, and which will give you an idea of what her character was like, what her fictional character was like. So it's Goodnight, Gracie, for Gracie Allen, 1906 to 1964. It's a kind of, I would say it's a kind of comic elegy. Quote, almost everything I know today, I learned by listening to myself when I was talking about things I didn't understand. Mrs. Burns, I love that zany character of yours. So do I, or else I wouldn't have married him. You mean you understand it? Well, of course. When I misunderstand what you say, I always know what you're talking about. Home very late from a Hollywood party, George and Gracie can hear their phone ringing, but can't find the key to get in. George is vexed and tired, but Gracie is dying to wake Blanche Morton next door and gossip about dancing with Gary Cooper. His belt buckle ruined my gardenia. Soon the Mortons are locked out. Gracie, did you close the door? No, but I will. The locksmith's tools locked in. Will his jealous new wife ever believe this? And the phone never stops. Day breaks, and George breaks in through a window. "I've got a wonderful idea," he announces. "From now on, we'll leave a door key under the mat." "But I put one there months ago," Gracie argues, "and we couldn't get in last night." The telephone again. Who's been trying to get through? "Gracie, who was on the phone?" "I was." Quote, "It's not a matter of whether I'm right or wrong. It's a matter of principle." Men are so deceitful. They look you right in the eye while they're doing things behind your back. Don't rush me. It isn't easy to make up the truth. Ronnie is their son. Ronnie's dying for a part in a new play whose famous author is fascinated by Gracie. But the only role still open is intended for a middle-aged actress, sole support of her widowed mother. "I'm a widow too," Gracie fibs, "and Ronnie supports me." Smitten, the playwright invites her to dine in his room. "My husband died in a shipwreck," she embroiders, "on our honeymoon." "Lucky you survived." "Oh, I wasn't there." In breezes Ronnie and asks for Dad. Gracie, thinking fast, he can never forget his father. Playwright, bewildered, but he never knew him. Gracie, triumphant, if he knew him, he'd forget him. Enter the widow Morton, with Ronnie's long-lost father to unravel Gracie's tangled web. Blushing, the playwright offers Ronnie a part. Ronnie's in heaven, Gracie's forgiven. The playwright, like George himself, resigned to applaud her irresistible assassinations. And the third part. "I may not be here long." "Where are you going?" "Oh, don't I wish I knew." "I didn't think people felt this wonderful when they were going. But then again, this is the first time I've gone." "If you ask me a question and I don't answer, don't be nervous. Just take your hats off." How casually we treated Gracie's illness. Those pills made me feel very secure. I figured we could go on this way year after year. It never entered my mind that anything would change it. Then one evening, Gracie had another one of her attacks. I gave her the pill. We held on to each other. But this time, it didn't work. When the pain continued, I called Dr. Kennemer, and they rushed Gracie to the hospital. 2 hours later, Gracie was gone. He's crazy about dancing. His new wife has got to be a very good dancer. Gracie thinks she's dying. Having opened by mistake Harry Von Zell's telegram meant to save George from a weekend seasick on his sponsor's yacht. Examine your wife, condition serious, urge you do not leave her. I'm a very sick woman, but my health is so good I didn't even know it. She's had 3 agencies send over their most attractive candidates to replace the late Mrs. Burns. Sounds like it won't be easy to fill her shoes. What size do you wear? How old was she when she passed on? Well, I'd rather not say. She hasn't passed on far enough for that. George, however, has already chosen his next wife, who, relieved, reprieved, would rather George hadn't explained. It's such a letdown. After this, how can I be gay about an ordinary thing like living? And I would like to read one more poem. And I'm kind of dedicating this one to Alice because we have a tradition in which I get to read a new poem. And I don't have new poems very often, but I do have a new poem. So I'd like to dedicate this to you. And I was recently invited to write a poem about a famous writer who has lived in Massachusetts and their house. And this was my response to that invitation. It's called Intimate Visits. I was lucky. I knew a great poet, and she was kind to me. The first time we were introduced, I told her I loved her poems. Thank you, she replied, then turned and walked away. Years later, I thought writing about her could be my rescue. But having come to know the depth of her privacy, I asked her if she would mind. I'm afraid there's not much to write about, she demurred. I told her to let that be my problem. Then she asked, but would you finish it? Was she being motherly, fearing disappointment, or expecting it? Then she asked if I would like to meet with her, to help if I had any questions. So I came to her apartment for exactly 1 hour at a time, and she would tell me stories about how hard it had been for her to get published, about what she had written under a pseudonym or published anonymously, or who her poems were really about. Things, she said, she'd never told anyone. Once I asked her if she would explain a certain line. Her answer, but it's obvious. Her sign that I could never again ask anything directly about her poems. One day she was expecting the books she had put in storage. Anyone who'd help unpack them and brush away the insect powder, she had allergies, could keep any of the books she didn't want for herself. I wanted them all. Years after she died, I slid her modern library giant Freud off a shelf, and a piece of onion skin, a bookmark, slipped from between the pages. An intimate note she'd written to her lover in the hospital, whose family had tried to destroy all their letters. Quote, your doctor doesn't seem to realize the boredom of hospital life for you when you are not asleep, that is. But I do. On one of my visits, we were interrupted by her doorbell, an unexpected delivery. We sat together on her couch as she unwrapped the package, a book she was in. She opened it to her page, a poem of her own, along with one she had chosen by another poet. And on a facing page, a recent photo, a full-page picture. I told her, not lying, that I thought she looked beautiful, thoughtful and elegant, though her hair was a little wild and her cheeks a little puffy from her medications. Without a word, she took the book and disappeared. After how many minutes, she finally returned and handed me the book, which I then continued to peruse. But as I leafed through the pages, I couldn't find her photo. That page was gone. The photograph was gone. With remarkable precision, she had torn it from the book.
Clapping. I'm clapping.
That's it.
I'm adding. There you are. Marilyn, you're going to come back too. Oops, let me try and get this. Where is it? I ask you to unmute, but I also want to add you to Spotlight. Let me remove myself and see if there's some kind of limit on that. So
Well, John, I hope you
Huh.
you noticed where we overlapped tonight. Oh, you're on mute.
Meryl, I'm trying to
Well,
add
thank
you.
you for noting the resonance.
Couldn't help it.
Well, I'm still trying to get Marilyn in, so
Okay,
There she
I'm
is.
be in now, yeah.
I'm trying to put you in. Put in.
There she
I'm
is. She's in.
I'm
I
in.
kn- Oh, I was just trying to put her on screen. Okay. Can we just go from here? Is this working? I can't make her picture larger. That's the problem. I'm trying to figure it out. Oh, well.
It's fine.
You could make ours
Oh, here it
smaller.
is. There we go.
Oh, great.
Well, I think we are the happy recipients of a wonderful National Poetry Month evening. You guys, you did us proud. It's so wonderful to hear your work read by you. You know how so often we get a chance to hear somebody else read somebody else's work and their interpretation of it, but hearing it from a poet is very special and precious. And I don't want you to ever feel that those of us who are the recipients of it don't acknowledge and appreciate that. So I just kind of wanted to volunteer that. Now you guys can go talk about more important things like the poetry itself, but I did want you to follow through on that translation thing. You were talking about Lloyd. I think you were starting a conversation with Marilyn a little bit.
Yeah, well, um, I have said this before. I think translation is an ethical act as well as a literary one, and that it's really it's one of the things that we can do as poets to to translate or be translated. That it's really very important. I am so grateful to know the poems, written in another language and in another country, from another country. Um, even even if I don't know the language, I do know the language of some of the poems that I've translated, but not all of them. And the one tonight was written in Hungarian. I don't know a word of Hungarian, but but um, I read a lot of different translations of that poem, and I didn't like any of the translations. Uh, but I loved the poem, and and it was great to be working on. I don't know, Marilyn, what's been your experience with translating?
Oh, Oh, I have done some,
Yeah, I know. But
both from languages I know pretty well and from language I don't know. I translated actually over COVID. During the COVID crisis, I spent most of my time working on translating a novel by a
oh,
Danish friend of mine who had died at the beginning of the
oh, wow.
period, and so I did that as a way of kind of feeling close to her and making a gift in her memory, and that was wonderful because I could hear her voice and I could see what she was doing. It was wonderful to just understand the kinds of loops she was tossing out to pull in, and it's great. And then a larger project I did probably in the 90s. David Slavitt, who had
Oh,
become the series editor of the University of Pennsylvania Press classic theater
Hmm.
in English, and he asked me to do Euripides' Hecuba, and I don't know why I said I could do it.
How's your Greek?
What possessed me to say yes? I don't know a single word of. I always say the only words I know in Greek are hoi and poloi, and but luckily the Hecuba there at that time there were about 4 translations of Hecuba into modern English, and I just laid all of the other translations out and line by line translated it without using any of the words that the other translators had used. And the only one that was impossible to avoid was the word sword. There's no other way of saying that, but it was the most challenging and
Wow.
humbling. I learned so much from it. Was like being in service to a truly great genius. And
Wow.
I could see through the other translations, I could see his genius. It was a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and I agree. I think translation is what did you say? It's a
Ethical
it,
as
it,
well as literary.
it really is. It means that you give up your own self-importance and serve the work of somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really an enriching experience.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I found that. John, you've been translated.
I have been translated and I haven't translated, although that is something that I would really like to do because I've always been fascinated with translation. And in fact, picking up on the idea of translation as an ethical act, you know, I think one of the sources of my fascination with translation, even though I'm not a translator, is my deep history or admiration for Curbstone Press, which, you know, brought many of most important and engaged writers in Latin America through Latin America to English-speaking audiences in the US for the first time, and began with a trip by Jim and Arlene Scully and their family down to Chile on a fellowship. But just as they were en route, Augusto Pinochet came into power with a bloody coup against the democratically elected Salvador Allende. And so, the book that came out of that began Curbstone Press. But then I think, after that, the book that really stuck with me was Jim and Arlene's and Maria Proser's translation of Teresa de Jesus, All of a Sudden. And Teresa de Jesus was a pseudonym because it was too dangerous for her to have her real name out there. She was a school teacher and a poet. And for years and years and years, the poets who came out of the resistance of Chile, they were still underground in a way. You couldn't share their names. And as I've always liked to read, I could read some Spanish and look at English translations. I've always enjoyed books like that. My work has been translated, and Curbstone Press went on to translate. There are Vietnamese poets and from Serbia too. Dragan Dragojevic, his book Death's Homeland, about the tragedy and the wars in the Balkans. And in 2012, my wife, who's here, Denise Abercrombie, who's also a poet, we traveled to Belgrade for the 49th International Poetry Festival. And a couple of years later, we went to Smederevo for another poetry festival. And I was really struck by, how poor that country was and how committed they were to international poetry festivals. And I thought of, American poetry festivals where very typically we're most interested in American poets. And there are poets just from all over the world there. And just, and the language barrier. My wife speaks French. We were traveling out into the Serbian countryside. Our leader was a poet, Bata, blanking on his full, Bratislav Milanovic, and he spoke French as well. So everything went to Bata, and then to Denise, and then to me, and then back again. In this dance of translation. And I'll also never forget the experience, though, of sitting and listening to poets read and perform their poems in languages that I couldn't access, but the beauty was still there. Like I could feel the language and in their body movement and the tone of voice. And it just reminded me how close, the language is just to the rest of us. So yeah, I hope to be a translator at some point, not just translated.
If
I encourage you.
just add one small thing to what you said about how instrumental Curbstone Press was for you and in the discovery of so many Latin American writers, especially poets, but Latin American writers. But even before Curbstone discovered this interest, it was doing translations from Danish.
Right.
It was one of the reasons I moved to the area, is because I had this Danish connection, and Curbstone was where Danish literature was happening in the United States. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you enter the world like an alternate universe when you enter that translated world, and you meet, I don't know, you experience things that wouldn't be available to you if you hadn't put one foot into that world of that alternate reality.
Yeah. One of my I think a source of inspiration is that the late David Ferry, who just died at the age of 99, had been translating Horace and Virgil over the years, wonderful translations. And he started his translation of the Aeneid in his late 80s and finished it in his early 90s.
Good Lord.
And I and it's wonderful. And but boy, is that an inspiration.
Well, it's interesting to see the new translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey coming out that are hitting the mainstream. And I would not have ever figured that had happened in my lifetime. But there's a great couple of, there's and the interest in Greek mythology. It's not just kids reading Percy Jackson. You're also reading Circe and Song of Achilles, and some of that is making it into the mainstream. So it's really fascinating to watch something that I thought was kind of stuffy when I was a kid, starting to become really very popular. I'm glad that someone made me read it when I was younger.
Yeah.
So what are you all working on now?
Poem by poem.
Poem by poem.
Yeah, whatever comes along. I don't have a, a collection in mind. But that's been the way I've worked, just poem by poem. And then after a certain period of time, themes start to appear, and connections, and then that becomes generative too, because then I see other possibilities, holes that have been left out between things I haven't written towards that might be part of that whole, conversation or body of work that's emerging. So piece by
Poem by
piece.
poem. Got it. Lloyd, where are you up to?
Well, I am I'm doing an event. You mentioned that I was the poet laureate of Somerville,
Yes.
and which is has been a really great thing. And I am planning an event at the end of April that was supposed to happen before the pandemic,
Oh my.
and that kind of got postponed. And it's a reading by it's a big reading by almost everyone I could think of in who was a resident of Somerville, who was a serious poet. In fact, there is at least one of those people is online tonight listening to us. And there are going to be over 30 poets, and each is going to be reading
Wow.
a poem of their own, and a poem that they love by someone else.
What a
And
nice event.
so that's
Is this virtual or actual?
actual.
So
Actual.
fun.
Yeah. So I can't wait for that. It'll be the very end of Poetry Month, but I have been looking forward to this for quite some time. And I've been working on a long poem for not that long, but it's long enough for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years.
Ooh, when are you going to birth it?
It's not done yet.
Okay.
I just revised it again this afternoon, and it's still not ready.
In the chat, someone asked what the date was for your
Oh,
Somerville
April
event.
28th. It's a Sunday evening at 5:30.
There you go, Peter. Marilyn, what are you working on?
Taking stabs once in a while at writing new poems, but I'm not really writing.
You did raise the question of whether you should publish the poems about the bad marriage. And as I understand the concern for people in your life that might have something to say or not about it, but honestly, as someone who got out of a bad marriage, I'd really love to hear the poems. Really, honest to God, you just don't know how many other people can really truly relate to the circumstances that are so artistically expressed when the last thing in the world I felt like was artistic. You know,
Yeah.
it's true. There's anyway. It's a tough time, and it's wonderful to hear somebody eloquently kind of pinpoint what was going on because I was crazy. It just made me crazy.
Well,
So
just,
I'm just trying to encourage you to think about it
yeah.
from the recipient
First time
standpoint.
I've ever read any of these poems to an
Well,
audience.
it hit me.
Well, I didn't know them at all. I didn't know you had written them, and boy, I want to read more of them. So no, thank you.
No, I'd love to see them out where people could share them or talk about them or have them or whatever. I think that's an untapped place because I mean, I know for myself, when I got divorced, I was angry but relieved and angry and tired. And I mean, just all of it was just a jumble that I couldn't sort out. And it was really nice to hear something expressed that way. And I, you know, I'm just putting a pin in wanting to hear them in a
I
publication.
I agree. I mean, bad relationships are a really great subject for poetry.
Oh, Beth, for any writer, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But
Oh, I'm hearing a bunch of agreements in the chat here, boys and girls. Just saying, that's all.
Yeah.
Well, you all, I have had a wonderful evening. I really can't thank Lloyd and John and Marilyn enough for being here and all of you who signed in. And I also want to reassure you that this has been recorded tonight and it'll go out on our YouTube channel. So if you want to come back and rewatch it and hear the poems again or share it with anybody else, please feel free to do so. I think it's a great way to kick off National Poetry Month. And I just can't thank the three of you enough for sharing your work with us. So
Thank you, Alice.
we're going to sign off, and it's so great to see you all.
Gratitude, Alice, and to
Gratitude
everyone.
back. Ciao, ciao.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.